It's a difficult time for our country, and trying to find the path that's reasonable and can build common ground as opposed to just sort of people tearing at each other is fundamentally what most people want. And we can't allow the debate to be as polarized but also dominated by the extremes.
Welcome to the show, Ira Shapiro. How's it going?
John, it's good to be with you and to reach your audience as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I know that you're a busy man right now. You are re-releasing a updated version of your book. I believe it is called The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. And that's re-releasing on May 14th, 2024. Is that correct?
That's right, John. It came out in 2022, and I was given the chance to update it, so I wrote about the last couple of years as well. So it was recent history, now it's current history.
Well, and with what's been going on in the last 2 years, I'm sure you had plenty to write about. So, as far as everything that's going on with the last 2 years and moving forward into this election time, I just recently, actually, I think it was this morning, saw Mitch McConnell on the news talking about Katie Britt, who obviously is a senator for Alabama. And I think that, what we saw during the State of the Union address with Joe Biden and then her response kind of is, in some way, a bit of a prime example of where we are as people and the disconnect that we have, Americans and senators and the people that we represent or that represent us. Do you feel like what we see with Brit and the Senate in general is kind of a reflection of the divisions that we have as Americans? And do you think that the Senate should do something to heal that divide?
John, I've probably spent more time thinking about the Senate than any reasonable person should. I got hooked on it when I was young, at a time when presidents Johnson in Vietnam War and Nixon with various things, including what became Watergate, presidents were failing us, and the Senate, to a large extent, stepped up and took on the biggest problems of the day and helped get the ship of the country through that difficult problem. We've watched the Senate decline over a long period of time. And what happened, I believe, when Donald Trump was elected, it was a time when we really needed a strong Senate to counterbalance a president who was corrupt and overreaching his power. And instead, we had sort of a nightmare scenario where the long decline of the Senate had weakened it and polarized it to the point that it couldn't do the job. And so what we saw basically was and this is what my book was about, was essentially the Senate's catastrophic failure to stop Trump's assault on our democracy. Interestingly, after the January 6th attack on the Capitol and after they again did not convict Trump of the impeachment against him, the Senate actually did some respectable work in 2022. They had a series of things they worked on, from the CHIPS and Science Act to infrastructure to the first modest, although inadequate, gun safety bill. And you actually saw that they can do the job when they actually work at it. The problem is that McConnell, in my judgment, and I've watched a long time, McConnell only allows the Senate to work every year or so out of every 7 or 8. So they haven't been doing the work of the country the way they should.
And that seems like actually a pretty good example of what's going on even in our citizenry, right? On the left, you do tend to have people that want to see things like you said, the Chips and Science Act, which is one of the most important pieces of legislation, in my opinion, leading into the potential industrial revolution of AI and green energy. And I think that on the left, you see a lot of people that really want to work hard to get things done and progress and bring in things like equality. And then on the right, you have almost like a subversion of the Republican Party with Donald Trump and the people that represent him. And those people, like Mitch McConnell, who in my opinion is just, it's kind of insane that he even supports him with all the rhetoric that Donald Trump has used against Mitch McConnell. And to have Mitch McConnell come out and support him after all of that really seems representative of what you see on the right now as far as their constituents go as well. Regardless of how much they get insulted or things don't get accomplished, they still seem to support Donald Trump. Do you think that what's going on with the Senate as far as Mitch McConnell and other Senate leaders, Lindsey Graham, what do they have to do to help heal that divide? I heard Katie Britt today talk about the fact that she wanted to heal this bipartisan divide, but obviously her State of the Union response didn't have anything to do with that. So what do
No,
they need to do?
well, that's exactly right. And look, I think that, as I said, in 2022, they did a number of things that looked like the Senate should perform. They did some bipartisan things. There are members there on the Republican side, maybe a quarter of them, who are embarrassed that they're in an institution that was failing so badly. And so when they had the chance, they did do some legislation. And McConnell perhaps wanted to make people forget just how badly he had failed the country when he let Trump off the hook and put us through what we've been dealing with for the last 3 years. The way I think about it, John, is that we're watching the legal system struggle to make up for the failure of the Senate to do its job. If the Senate had convicted Trump after January 6th in the second impeachment trial, he would have been eliminated as a candidate. That was the constitutional road to do it. They didn't do it that way. And as a consequence, then we see the court system struggling to bring about a positive result. But it's not the way it should have been done. So what accounts for it? I think that there's no doubt that Trump captured the Republican Party, and the people who should be standing up to him in the Republican Party haven't done so, with the very few exceptions like Liz Cheney, for example. Yep. One of the writers in one of the policy and writer people in Washington had a good summary, I think, in one sentence of what happened with McConnell. His partisanship ultimately overwhelmed his patriotism. And when she said that, it struck me that here's McConnell who knows better, basically, who actually detests Trump, who believes in his heart of hearts that another Trump presidency would be a disaster for the country. And yet his partisanship is such that he can't say what he really knows to be true. And that's pretty bad. That's a pretty bad failure. You know, we think about these and we all think about this in political terms, but it's kind of an ethical issue, really, and a moral issue. If you're Mitch McConnell and you've worked with 7 presidents, you've had this privileged position as a senator for 40 plus years and as a leader for 22 years, don't you owe it to the people of this country to say what you know to be true? Namely, Trump would be a disaster for our country, terrible for our allies. He would hand Ukraine to Putin on a platter. I can't support someone like that. But McConnell couldn't do it.
Yeah. And that's in my opinion, really exactly what the Senate should be doing, right? Is the Liz Cheney version of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It just seems over and over you see these Republican senators that have been panned, they've been insulted, they've been degraded by Donald Trump, and then they turn around and they support him. And it really does seem like partisan politics to the point of just letting the country go to a potential dictator. And people like Mitch McConnell need to stand up and lead by example. And for whatever reason, he seems scared to do
Yeah.
so.
Well, I think you're right, John. And I always say, or I've been in and around politics and government a long time. I worked in the Senate, I worked in the Clinton administration. I've written about this. I don't expect perfection from these people, and I understand political compromises, but I do think that senators have an obligation to get beyond just their party and just their state. If they wanted to be state legislators, they should stay in their state. Nothing wrong with that. But the United States senators, they have the most privileged position you can have in our system, virtually, and they owe it to us to think about the national interest, not just their parties. John McCain's famous saying was country first. And what we see here, so I don't mind people making compromises, and, I understand that. But when you see a president endangering the democracy, opposing and undermining the peaceful transfer of power, a president who, if he came back to office, would essentially undermine our allies, NATO, Ukraine, etc., you ought to do something about it. That's kind of what your job is supposed to be.
Yeah, that's your responsibility, right? Like that's as the
Yeah,
Senate, you
yeah,
should
yeah.
be the way I look at the Senate, and you, my friend, have about a billion times more experience than I do. But the way I look at the Senate is as like the parent in the room, right? You have the House, which right now looks like a bunch of children, to be honest with you, at least on the right. But it almost seems like a lot of political theater happening in the House, and then you're supposed to have this, kind of parental Senate that's saying, "Hey guys, let's get it together. You guys get some legislation, pass it our way, so that way we can get it up to the president. The president's gonna, push it along, and we're gonna get some stuff done." And like you said, when it came to the Chips and Science Act, when it came to the Bipartisan Gun Control Act, when it came to the American Recovery Act, when it came to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, those things were really like kind of rolling and getting things done, and it felt good as an American because you felt like we were moving forward. And it feels like we need a parent in the room. Like the Senate needs to step up and be that supervisor, have the supervisory role. Do you feel like that's where the Senate is right now? Like that they're kind of fighting amongst themselves and they're not representing the American people?
Look, I think you describe it well. I think that, whether one calls it, Howard Baker, one of the great leaders, used to call it the nation's board of directors. Walter Mondale said the Senate's the nation's mediator. There are these tough problems, and somehow we're going to figure out a way to bring people together, all regions, all parties, see what you can work out. And you ultimately find that if you're operating in good faith and trying to find solutions, you can do it. And they've done it as recently as the Chips and Science Act and the bipartisan gun safety bill and marriage equality, etc. They can do it. But apparently, when it comes to Donald Trump, they then shrink back. They become afraid of their shadows. They can't take Trump on. And his capture of the party has essentially undermined the ability of people to work together. Now, McConnell, at the time of the second impeachment trial, nobody condemned Trump more harshly than McConnell did. He was eloquent, and then he voted to let him off. And he said to somebody, I'm not much of a leader if I just go with a few other senators. Well, the point is, there were only a few other Republican senators because he didn't exercise any leadership. He didn't show any character or courage. If he had voted to impeach, there would have been a convict, there would have been an ample number to convict. So it really does come down to character and what you owe the people of your state and the country. I enormously admire Liz Cheney. We would disagree about a bunch of different things, but she's a real patriot. And there haven't been enough of them in the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I think when you say that about John McCain, that's actually real close to my heart. As I've continued to say this about the right and the reality bending abilities that they have nowadays, where they went from the party of being, completely respectful of the military, always supporting the troops, to questioning the honor of a POW, of a person that it literally, stood up, as you said, and led by example in a bipartisan way. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest problems leading into the Obama McCain election was that people were, on the right were upset that he was willing to reach across the aisle. I famously remember watching the rally as McCain was finding out that Obama was going to win, and I remember people booing, and I remember John McCain saying, "No. Don't boo. Don't boo." He's like, Obama's going to be a good president. And they
Yeah,
booed him. And they
yeah,
booed
yeah.
so loudly. And I really feel like that's where things started to kind of go downhill, right? But then obviously McCain was in the Senate for a long time, still working. And his voice was a part of it. Liz Cheney, obviously, also standing up. And as you said, like, yeah, on a lot of policy, I'm probably going to disagree with her. But as Americans, it's great to see somebody stand up for America. Because I've been in management for almost 20 years. And I know that there are times where you have to sacrifice your own opinion, your own motivations for the betterment of the company and the people that you represent. And that's how I look at the Senate, is that they need to be able to stand up and say, hey, we're not going to get the win we wanted this time, but it's going to be best for everybody that we go this route. And it seems like it's incredibly lacking right now. How do you feel about what Joe Biden has done? Do you think that Joe Biden has handled Mitch McConnell well? I saw he said when McConnell was stepping down that though he didn't see eye to eye with him on policy a lot, that McConnell did work with him pretty well. Do you feel like that's an honest answer from Biden, or is that a political answer?
Well, I think it's a little of both. Look, I think Joe Biden has done a great job under very difficult circumstances. We're an angry, divided, somewhat depressed country particularly coming out of COVID. I think there was a COVID overhang and it still affects people's attitudes. Somebody said to me, Biden's approval ratings are low. I said, well, any president in this period would have low approval ratings. Look at his accomplishments. I think that Biden said that he would work. He's always been bipartisan to the core. He believes the system should work that way. He said he would work with anybody if they would work with him, and I think that's what he did. He's done a bunch of things on a bipartisan basis, and when there was no Republican support, he did some things with only Democrats, like the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think Biden has been very consequential president, and I think he has gotten as much out of Congress as he possibly could have, bipartisan where possible, on his own and with the Democrats where necessary. So it'd be hard to envision a better performance under these circumstances.
I think that when I'm having conversations with Trump supporters, they can't really speak to any legislation that Joe Biden has pushed forward. And almost everybody kind of just goes to that point of, well, he's old and, oh, he has dementia. Obviously, anybody that watched the State of the Union address could say Joe Biden does not have dementia. He spoke very well at that time, and obviously, if you look at just his legislation, you can also speak to the fact that he did a really good job as a president. And just recently, they even released that the polls from those political historians saying that Joe Biden was somewhere in the area of like the 10th or 11th president, while obviously Donald Trump was pretty much dead last. So I
Yeah.
don't think that you could have gotten more out of a president, like you said, coming out of a global pandemic. It's a lot like when people discuss, the 1930s and the Depression. If you expected things to be great right after that, then you're not being very honest with yourself about what you expected from the president. I think that Joe Biden has done a great job considering what he had and then looking at the Congress that he's dealt with since then. What do you think? Because obviously this is a huge, talking point, I guess you could call it, for the right, and even some people on the left have been talking about this as well. Do you think that we have an age problem in the Senate? People bring it up about Joe Biden. I point towards this legislation. Do you think that we have a problem with the age in the Senate? And I think it's 65 is the average right now, with considerations towards things like AI and green energy and where that's going. Do you think that we should be looking at trying to get younger people like Katie Britt into the Senate, or do you think we're good with what we have?
I think in general, we need younger blood. I think that we have too many senators who are too old. We had the ludicrous example of Chuck Grassley, who chose to run again at the age of 89. 40 plus years wasn't enough for him. And to the embarrassment of Iowa, they decided to give him another 6 years. I think we are getting, look, there's some positive things about the Senate over time. When I was there working as a staffer, there might have been one woman in the Senate. I think there was two for a brief moment. Now there's 25. There's a more diverse makeup of the Senate. We're going to have more African American senators. We're going to have more Hispanic senators. We have gay senators. It's more of a diverse group than it was, but by and large, it's time for the younger leaders to step up, as they are around the country. You look around and you find we've got mayors and governors and state legislators that are exceptional leaders, and they're in their 30s, 40s, maybe their 50s. And so I think for people like me who are older, we can contribute by writing some things or try to reflect on what we've done or when we're asked. But should be a younger person's game. It's the world they're going to have to live in. Yeah. And I don't want my grandchildren being represented by only 85-year-olds.
And so when we talk about that kind of thing where you have something like AI, I just saw recently that Joe Biden actually had done something as far as putting forth I think he was asking for an AI chief or something of that sort in each of the departments. And that's great on his part, right? Like to stay up to date, make sure that we're getting people in but when we talk about places like China, we talk about places like Russia or India, these competitors on the world stage, and even the Europeans, we are talking about AI, and we are talking about the green energy evolution, right? And so I think that we need those people that know something about where we're going with that and have skin in the game. Like you said, I have 2 kids of my own, and that's what I think about, right? This is no longer even my world. I'm 44, turning 45 this year. But even for me, it's not my world anymore. It's my children's world. And they're the ones that are going to deal with the consequences of whatever decisions are made in the Senate. So I very much agree with that.
Yeah, let me make a couple of, just on your points, a couple of distinctions. I mean, when people point to Biden's age, which I think is a legitimate issue to raise, it's also true that Biden has put together a strong administration. He's got some very capable people up and down the line, not just in the cabinet, but around the agencies. He's got younger talent in the administration. So it's not a one man, the presidency is not a one man or one woman job. It's the putting together of an administration that brings talents to the table. When I say the Senate has an age problem, or I acknowledge it an age problem, I do think that younger leaders should be coming forward, but I don't think that's the only problem. I think that the Senate, I get frustrated as somebody who's followed it for a long time, that the Senate rules haven't been looked at since 1979. You know, we hear a lot about the filibuster. We hear a lot about holds that are put on pieces of legislation or nominations that stop the Senate from acting. Well, the senators ought to do something about that. They ought to look at the rules and see where the rules aren't working, and they ought to change them. It's been many years since Trent Lott, who was a leader but no radical by any means, said in 2005, he said, the rules need to be looked at. Well, that was almost 20 years ago. They were 25 years old at that time. So it's not just the age of the senators, it's a question of whether the institution is able to work as effectively as possible with some very daunting responsibilities that they have.
And why do you think? Because you're making a great point there. It's not just the age of the senators, but it's also the age of our laws, right? We continue to go back to what I think is obviously the basis for our country and one of the greatest, starts to an experiment as far as countries can go, and that's our Constitution. But even the Constitution at times needs to be amended, right? Like new things need to be added, things need to be changed. So what you're saying is we need to also do that with these laws. What was it the Supreme Court was just bringing up in the IVF case, or the Mephistoprone case, the Comstock Act, right? Wasn't that, was it 1876 or something like
right.
that? Yeah, it's insanity that we're still reaching that far back to find a justification for something in 2024. And even though I'm a pro Second Amendment person in certain areas, I think that we have to take a look at the Second Amendment. And, obviously they were discussing things in a completely different manner when the Constitution was written to where we're at now. And even when we look at laws like you're talking about that are just in the Senate, that stuff needs to be updated as well to keep up with the rest of the world, right?
I think so. I think that, you're making a good point. If you only have one U.S. Senate. If you hamstring it with rules that don't work and couple that with significant partisanship that undermines what you might otherwise be done. Look, I respect the people that are able to even do legislating because it's hard work. It takes a lot to bring together a diverse and contentious society and reconcile those differences. But you need people trying to do it. You need rules that make it possible to do it. And at the moment, we haven't had either of those.
Yeah. And so, speaking of like kind of what's going on with the Supreme Court in I can't say that word. The Plan B pill. We have a very similar situation that Mitch McConnell was involved in back in Obama's presidency with Justice Sotomayor. And people now are asking Sotomayor, who's turning 70 this year, to step down to give Biden the ability to replace that seat in case he does not win re-election. How do you feel about that? Because coming from a guy with your type of experience, obviously you have a much better idea of whether it's a good idea or not than I do. But obviously a lot of us kind of have PTSD over what happened with RBG and looking at the now 6-3 Supreme Court with the Roe v. Wade being overturned and all those things. Do you think Sotomayor should step down, or?
No, I do not think she should step down. But let me back up for a second. Mm-hmm. I think there is a change that needs to be made we are the only constitutional democracy that doesn't have term limits or age limits for its Supreme Court. Now, if you think about that, these justices can be on there for life, or they can time their retirement to make sure that the president who is in power is in their party. Neither of those things work, in my opinion, and no other country does it that way. So I believe that we should have term limits, and there's been a growing support for the idea that justices might only be on there for 18 years, let's say 18 or 20, and then they would leave and they take senior status. So they might still be able to do something, but they wouldn't be on the highest court. I think that makes sense. I think that, however, Sotomayor has not been on the court 18 or 20 years yet. She's not 79 or 80. She's 69. She'll be 70 this year.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't think of her as someone who should get off the court. It's unfortunate that Justice Ginsburg, who was a great, great justice, did stay too long. She was ill, and she was amazing how long she lasted with her cancer, but she should not have stayed on the court as long as she did. But I don't think that applies to Sotomayor. But I would change the system overall.
Yeah, and I actually really enjoy that answer because I'm actually on the side of Sotomayor not stepping down, because I also agree that at 70 years old she's fine. She doesn't have the health concerns that RBG obviously did. I loved RBG. My wife is younger than me, didn't know about RBG, and we sat there and we watched the documentary on RBG after she passed, and I think that was really big for my wife to see.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, RBG, she was a great, great lawyer, fabulous, fabulous, groundbreaking lawyer, and then a great justice. But she stayed too long. And she's not the only person that's ever done that. The first senator I ever worked for as an intern was Jacob Javits of New York. He was actually one of the great senators. He made the mistake of running for a fifth term, I think it was, when he actually had ALS. And he couldn't conceive of the Senate without him, and he couldn't conceive of his life without being a senator. And they made a bad decision, and it led to the election of Alphonse D'Amato as opposed to Elizabeth Holtzman, who would have been an excellent senator. So it's unfortunate when we had the more recent example with Dianne Feinstein. Yep. Dianne Feinstein should not have run for another term when she was 85, and she tarnished an extraordinary record. That this as a Californian. I mean, yep. I followed Dianne Feinstein from the time she was on the Board of Supervisors, and I thought it was quite tragic that she decided to run again and stay in the Senate as long as she did. People have to have good judgment, or they have to have family and friends who can give them good advice.
Yeah, and we see that, I was going to say, even Mitch McConnell's case, obviously he had the recent fall where he hit his head, and then he had a couple times there where he had frozen up at those speeches. And it just seems more and more often we're seeing that. Do you think that's because... Is it like party loyalty? They're afraid that whoever's coming next isn't going to be able to keep the seat. Is that pressure from the party even to stay in that seat until, obviously, in Dianne Feinstein's case, unfortunately, her passing away? Or you think there's some other reason for why they're doing? They just need that in their life, that purpose.
I think it's mostly the latter point you make, John. I think it's not party loyalty as much as it's deferring to the senator to let them make their own decision. You know, the staff won't tell them anything because the staff believes in the senator and likes to keep its job. The
Yeah.
friends are reluctant to say anything, I guess. I just think, I don't think you're doing the senators any favor by not speaking truth to them. And yet, I know with Feinstein, there were a lot of people who thought it was just going badly and couldn't bring themselves to say anything to her.
It's a very human element to that too,
Yeah, I
and
think so.
being in management, I understand those things. I understand when you have somebody like Feinstein who is an icon. Same thing with RBG, an absolute icon. It's hard to say to those people, "Hey, this might be the time for you to go," because, like you said, for some of those people, their job depends on those people being there. But also, there's a very like this person has meant so much to us and has done so much to us. It's hard to say that to intervene. And obviously, like I said, even with McConnell, we've seen that on the right as well. Speaking of California in the Senate, I wanted to ask you, this is a personal question. What do you think about Adam Schiff running against Garvey?
Well, first of all, I think Adam Schiff will decisively defeat Garvey.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll be a close election. I'm a great admirer of Adam Schiff, though. I think Adam Schiff, if you listed 5 people who did their best to save our democracy from Trump's assault on it, Adam Schiff would be in those 5. I mean, if you look at the first impeachment trial, if you look at his work on the House Intelligence Committee, if you look at the January 6th committee, Adam Schiff was always a leader there, and all of those things. And even the Republicans in the first impeachment trial, they were going to vote for Trump no matter what. But they all knew Schiff did a great job on this. They used to say to each other, Schiff's really doing a good job on this. We're not going to be persuaded by it, but Adam Schiff is extraordinary public servant.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that because I'm a big fan of Katie Porter. I really liked what she did in
I
the
like
House.
Katie Porter very much.
I
I
wish she
like,
wouldn't have ran, to be honest with you, because she still had one term in the House, right?
well, she's going to be done at the end of the year. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, was she? Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, no,
And
but look, Katie Porter, I think Katie Porter is a terrific member of Congress and a real leader. I just think Adam Schiff had such an extraordinary record at a time of great travail for our democracy that I think he deserved to go to the Senate if he wanted to, and was evidently able to convince enough voters to advance him.
awesome. It's just good to hear because I know a little bit about Schiff, obviously from the Trump impeachments and stuff, and but I didn't know on a professional level enough about him to feel great about him going. But from what you're saying there, it makes me feel really good. And we do need heroes right now. I don't think that people completely understand. I think a lot of people are politically exhausted. I think that Trump, he's obviously just like an onus upon our society right now, and we can't get past this Jerry Springer, Maury Povich type of time where we have this reality TV show guy that kind of came through and really just wrecked shop. And I think we need heroes. So Adam Schiff, I even saw him in the speaking to Robert Hur after he had released his report, and I was very impressed with him there as well. So it just feels good to hear from a person like yourself that has covered the Senate as long as you have, that you respect him that much. So I really appreciate you saying that.
No, I
That's
think
awesome.
he's what we used to call the real deal. I think
Awesome.
he's really good.
So what do you think with McConnell's obviously not stepping down until what, 2027? Is that when he's out?
Well, no, I mean, as leader, he will cease to be the leader at the end of the year.
Okay.
Then he has 2 more years on his term. I'm not, some people would say he won't even serve out the term. I don't know. But he won't be leader anymore in those last 2 years. So the question then becomes, I guess, who's going to be the next Republican leader in the Senate after McConnell's record length tenure there? And I think, frankly, everything depends on the presidential election. If Trump, God forbid, were to win the election, I don't think he will, but if he did, he would name the next Senate Republican leader. And it would be somebody from one of the MAGA Republicans, like J.D. Vance or Martha Blackburn or, God, anyway.
Yeah.
If Trump doesn't win and Biden wins, then it's a more open contest. Somebody who might have been on McConnell's leadership team, like John Cornyn or John Thune, would have a chance in those circumstances. They wouldn't have a chance if Trump wins. So, look, from my standpoint, the Senate is in danger, or Senate Republicans are in danger of becoming more like the House because some of the more moderate ones are actually leaving. But everything depends on the defeat of Trump. Smashing this iteration of the Republican Party is what has to be done. And I say that as somebody who, I worked with a lot of Republicans successfully, and I always respected any number of them. But the party has moved over a long period of time to a more radical, nihilistic approach. It's fundamentally a increasingly white Christian party with a tendency toward fascism. And that can only be ended by defeating Trump to begin with.
Yeah, and that's what my next question would be is where does the Republican Party go? And I do see exactly what you're saying, that I don't see anybody in Trump's camp that really can out Trump, right? Or even, I mean, all these Congress people in the Freedom Caucus are obviously kind of riding his coattails and making every attempt to be very Trump-like. But I just don't think that there's anybody that quite compares to him when it comes to the
No.
divisiveness and the chaos that he brings. So,
No,
do
I
you
think,
think that that's where it goes?
look, we have this discussion when Ron DeSantis was rising
Oh,
briefly, etc. I don't I think Trump is a very special case. I think it's important to realize that how long Trump was in the mentality of the country, how long people had followed him in different ways. I read once, there's a Gallup poll question in 1990. Gallup poll asked, do you think Donald Trump gets too much publicity? That was 25 years ago. That was, no, sorry, that was 35 years ago.
yeah, yeah.
That was before 14 years on The Apprentice. So Donald Trump has been around a long time. And came across something funny the other day. I was reading an essay about Barack Obama. And one of Barack Obama's biographers quote him at some point saying years before, well, a lot of Americans, they don't think they'll ever be as rich as Donald Trump is, but maybe they'd like to be. Barack Obama referencing Donald Trump long before he became president. I mean, Trump's a special case. And now, there are things that Trump has done, issues that he has raised, attitudes that he has conveyed that do reflect a certain responsiveness to people that have been left behind. I think there's no doubt that there are people in our country who think the coastal elites have forgotten about them. And Trump, I think, tapped into some of that. I think he's an unusual spokesman for them, but I do think he tapped into some of that. And he also, and I don't underestimate this, I think his communicating by Twitter was a new form of political communication. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people in the country felt their president was talking to them in his own way. So I see some of that, and I understand some of it. But the thing that I would wonder about is whether Trump could have done certain things without ratcheting up the hatred across the boards. That's one of the things that upsets me the most. I mean, anti-Semitism rising, anti-Asian sentiment rising, Muslims, Black Americans. The fundamental thing that a president has to do first and foremost is to try to bring us together, or to try to hold together a diverse society. And Trump has done the exact opposite. Trump has drawn the lines between his people and everyone else and ratcheted up the hatred across the boards.
Mm-hmm. And he tapped into, I was reading something the other day, and like I said, about my background is I have a ability to speak to this a bit, is that he speaks to the lower middle class. And I've said this a million times, just like you just said, I don't understand how people see him as a representation of who they are, but I clearly think that the Republican Party, or the party of Trump, as I call it, is a party that is symbolism over substance. And that is, as long as he stands up there and says the right things, as long as he tells people he's bringing back coal, as long as he tells people he's closing the border, I mean, things that are obviously hyperbolic. You don't just close the border. That's not how anything works. As long as he says those things, unfortunately, he's always going to garner respect and interest from people that come from my background. And I point this out to my viewers a lot. I would say something like along the lines of Donald Trump is not a very intelligent person. And people would say, how much money do you have? And I'd say, well, let's remember that being intelligent doesn't make you wealthy, and being wealthy doesn't make you intelligent. And I think we have a huge problem in our country with, as you said, I think on the left this is a problem for us. And this is something that I want to work on. This is something that I feel I have a very unique set of skills for. And that is reaching people in a way that they can understand. A way that maybe we saw what happened with Hillary Clinton during her time, and I was part of that problem. I should have spoke up in defense of Hillary. But I think that we have a hard time reaching those people on the left, and I think if there's anything that the left can learn from this is exactly what you said. You take something like Twitter, and Donald Trump used it to a massive effect to reach people that felt disenfranchised, unrepresented, and lost. And so on the left, I think that we could do a better job of that. I think Joe Biden's done a great job of being, regardless of what people say, I think he's been a great uniter. I think he's been a very solid person in the job to keep us from going the route that Donald Trump was obviously taking us. And I'd like to see the next generation of Democrats and left-leaning people be a little more considerate of speaking to the people that Donald Trump was able to talk to. Do you think that the left can do that? Do you think that we can make that change?
Well, I like to think so. I think that the country has some enormous problems. And in a sense, people who are reacting to massive inequality in the country. I mean, advanced society that's as unequal as ours is.
Mm-hmm.
There's something in technology and globalization, and I'm a former trade official, so I know some of that. There's something in technology and globalization that creates inequality. It's the job of government to figure out a way to offset that. And what we've had with the Republicans, they don't offset it. They basically exacerbate it. Things are getting unequal, so therefore we'll have more tax cuts for the wealthy and make them even more unequal. One of the things about Biden that I admire, when he says that he's trying to build our economy from the middle class out, he really means it. He's pro-union. He's pro-consumer. He's trying to take on the corporations by bringing back antitrust laws, making our companies compete as opposed to just swallow up things. So I'm a big fan of Robert Reich at Berkeley, former Secretary of Labor, who is probably the most articulate in explaining what's happened to our country and the economy since 1980, when Reagan became president. And that inequality, and which has left a lot of people behind, Trump to some extent taps into that without coming up with the solutions that would actually make a difference. And Biden, I think, is trying, really trying, and has made some steps.
That's why I call it symbolism over substance. Being in leadership as long as I have, I know the worth of a person that understands how to get the job done without making a bunch of noise. You know,
I should have asked you what do you do when you're not doing these kind of podcasts?
So I've been in grocery, in retail management at the store that I work in now for almost 20 years. I've done every job that you possibly can. Like I said, I come from a very poor background. I grew up in Bakersfield, California. I grew up with no electricity, no running water. I have some stories, you know, and that taught me how to work hard and how to lead and how to be empathetic towards the people that are around me. And having two children and a wonderful wife that I've been with for over 20 years now has made me into a person that cares about the future of America and the people around me. So that's led to me being a better leader in my store. And right now, in a time where grocery is difficult, my store is doing amazing. And that's not because of me. That's because, as you said earlier about presidents, I put people in positions of leadership that can handle their job, and to be honest with you, I don't think they even need me anymore.
Well, that's great, though. That's a great way to lead.
Yeah. And so that's my thing is, I think that from my unique background and the things that I have going on, that I want to show people substance, and I want to show them that what Joe Biden has done as a president has actually been very substantial, and that the legislation that he's put forth in that 2022 time is going to last generations. I really believe that the CHIPS Act and where AI is going to push America into quite possibly the driver's seat when it comes to AI. And I may be biased, but I believe that America should be in that driver's seat. I think that we will be the country that most represents the ability to use something like that to help benefit the world, regardless of some of our past actions.
Yeah.
I would like a little bit of maybe a path to redemption, you know, in that area. But I think that's what we have to do as left leaning people, is that we need to take care of our poor. We need to make sure that the wealthy hold up their end of the deal. And I really, really do believe that we need to show appreciation to the middle class and everything that the middle class has done over the last, 80 years?
Well, no, it's great that you're doing these podcasts and getting your views out, getting people to talk with you, giving me the opportunity and others to reach your audience as well. It's a difficult time for our country, and trying to find the path that's reasonable and can build common ground as opposed to just sort of people tearing at each other is fundamentally what most people want. And we can't allow the debate to be as polarized, but also dominated by the extremes.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, this is a great talk. I really appreciate you coming on here. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and about the books that you got and all that stuff, and what they can read about all the awesome stuff that you've covered during your time covering the Senate?
Well, thank you. Well, authors always we can't live with Amazon or without them. So you can, Ira Shapiro, The Betrayal, you can find the book there. The updated edition comes out May 14th. And, you know, my website's www.irashapiroauthor.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed that conversation. And if you want to see more conversations like that, check out these podcasts. Until next time, remember, get educated and get out and vote.